So, Haskel, good afternoon. Let me first of all congratulate you with the Bywaters Award that you are going to receive tonight at the banquet for your outstanding career devoted to the clinical and basic research in the field of acute renal failure. It's a great honor for me, who I'm a long-standing admirer of your career too, that I may interview you for this occasion. I may call your birth date, yes? You're not offended if I call if I name your birth date. So you were born the 17th of July. This is so it's your birthday in a few days.
In a few days, yes.
In 1929, and you were born in India, in Bombay, actually. And I see from your curriculum vitae that you then went there to school, of course, and that you stayed in Bombay, let's say, up to the years of 44. Is that something?
1945.
1945. Why did you leave India and you went then to Lebanon or so? Or?
Yes, the family had to make a big decision, and that is to go to Canada or to come to Israel. And as such, the conditions and the atmosphere was such that it was after the war, and we felt that we belonged to Israel and not to start another diaspora in Canada. So I suggested that to my family, and you know something, they accepted it. And we all went to Israel, which was still in the making, and I went to Lebanon, which is next door, to study at the American University of Beirut, which was then at the height of its career, of its fame, and because there was no medical school in Jerusalem yet.
So there was actually at that time no medical school in whole Israel?
In the whole of Israel, Palestine, there was no medical school.
I see. So you started your studies then in Beirut. When did you decide to become a doctor, and why? Or is that a too difficult question?
I remember an incident. I was in 7th grade in Bombay when the principal in the Scottish high school, Mr. Mackay, came in and said, I want to ask you all, what are you going to be? Who is going to be a lawyer? And I did not feel that I wanted to be a lawyer. He said, who is going to be a doctor? And I managed to put my hand up very shyly. And since then, I believed in that.
Really? So how many hands went up in that class? Do you remember?
I think only two, mine and someone else.
I see.
Whom I cannot remember.
Your training at the American University in Beirut was that, as you said, that was already one of the most famous universities in that area.
Yes.
Was that basically a traditional curriculum, you remember, with lots of theory and then some clinical practice? How was that conceived or was the concept of?
I think the American University of Beirut was an excellent university at the time. It had professors from the US who came on sabbatical years to spend time. The best of the best were there, actually. And I was exposed to many good teachers, and I am thankful to them. For example, one of the colorful teachers was Dr. Ryman with the periodic disease, Ryman's disease, Ryman's peritonitis, and which later was called familial Mediterranean fever by my Israeli boss, Professor Heller.
So you started already during your student time to be interested in what later was a subject of interest.
Yes, the kidney diseases. I was always attracted to kidney diseases, and I remember that after a few years in Tel HaShomer, I asked that to be left to go to England with the help of the British Council. I was a British Council scholar to go to England to study kidney diseases with Professor Graham Bull.
But before that, you first had to take a training in internal medicine, I believe, or not?
Yes. There was an interesting incident. When I came, I was very much impressed by pediatrics. And I said to the boss of the hospital, I want to do pediatrics. He said, but you know, why waste your time on pediatrics? you should do medicine. And my answer was, just medicine I already know. And he almost fell off his chair.
Can you imagine? So he did not consider pediatrics to be medicine?
Well, it was for, for lady doctors, for young people.
Yeah. Small medicine for small
medicine,
patients.
yes.
Yes. So the training actually for a nephrologist, if I may jump now to nowadays in Israel, because there is still a discussion in Europe whether you could, after your graduation as a doctor or as an MD, could directly go into nephrology, or whether you would have to pass several years in internal medicine. What are your feelings about this?
My feeling is that nephrology is not technology of dialysis, and I maintained that. I called our unit the Department of Nephrology, meaning that it has to be an all-encompassing nephrology and not just dialysis. This brought me a lot of conflicts and contradictions with internal medicine. I wanted that we will not be only dialysis, just as the cardiologist would not call cardiac catheterization cardiology. It's only a means of diagnosis, and dialysis is only a means of treatment. That's why I maintained, and I still maintain, that any nephrologist has got to be a good internist before he goes into the specialty of nephrology. He's got to do some medicine, internal medicine, to know what is scarlatina, what is familial Mediterranean fever, what is hypertension. All these have to be known so that he can be called, when he is called on consultation, it's not going to be just, is this a dialysis or not a dialysis? Any nurse can do a dialysis. And he has got to give the overall nephrological diagnosis and approach to treatment.
I see. So after your training in Beirut, then you came definitely to Israel, to Tel Aviv, to the Tel HaShomer Government Hospital. Why is it called the Government Hospital? That's a public hospital, or?
May I tell you that I had an internship in Duke University in 1953, and I went to Geneva, from there to Paris, and I bought a ticket even from Cherbourg to New York.
Goodness.
And then a few days later, I went to the salesman or the ticket man and asked him to change it to Haifa. And of course it was by boat, because you didn't travel at the time you did not go by planes. And I remember the face of the man. He says, "From west to east, what's happening?"
Yeah.
I said, "Never mind, I'll go east." And I went to Tel HaShomer. It was then a government hospital. There was Ben Gurion, who was the prime minister, the founder of the State of Israel. When he got the state, he needed a general hospital, not just a labor union hospital, which was at the time. And so he went to Sheba, who was the doctor, the chief physician of the army, and told him, "Find me a hospital and do a government hospital, something that will accept anybody, from army personnel to civilians to tourists to Arabs to anybody who needs a hospitalization." And that's why it was called a government hospital until it had even a number 5.
Oh, really?
And a few years later, he changed the name to Tel HaShomer.
What is Tel HaShomer meaning?
The hill of the guard.
I see.
The hill of the guard. It's a little hill.
Yeah.
It guarded Tel Aviv area, so to speak, the entrance to Tel Aviv. And it was outside the city. And this was the place that was chosen. And it was, in the beginning, rather a military hospital with the barracks which were built by the American Army. to withstand the withdrawal of the British from the attacks of Rommel.
I see.
Rommel came from Africa, invaded Egypt even, and they were expecting to have to withstand or have a foothold in Palestine.
Line of defense there.
Line of defense, yes. And the Germans had a pincer movement. They came from Greece and from Egypt.
So both sides.
Yes, and that's how this hospital was built. This was an army camp, a hospital, everything. And then Sheba came and transformed it into a general hospital.
So the equipment and the comfort in what was first a military hospital must not have been very big. It must
No.
be a rather rough situation to work in.
Yes, it was a very low standard in the beginning. Even when I came in 1953 and joined it, it was really very low standard. And me and some others tried to build up something that is worthwhile. And I think that we did arrive to something that is nice. Today the hospital is completely different. You would not recognize what was there.
Now, before doing that, before actually going to that hospital, you took a training in nephrology in Belfast. Now, it struck me when I read your career and when your curriculum vitae, you have been trained in what nowadays, fortunately Beirut has changed, but let's say in the recent history have been two rather violent cities, Beirut and Belfast. If you look now back towards these periods, you told me that at that time they were two peaceful cities.
Beirut was a beautiful city, very peaceful. You could go anywhere. You would neither be attacked nor robbed or anything. And I studied in that city, and today it is transformed into a violent city. And when I came to Belfast, it was a beautiful city, but when I left it, it became violent also. So I studied...
Nothing to do with you?
Nothing to do with me, but I studied in these two cities, and unfortunately these two cities became violent.
What made you choose Belfast? Was that the presence of Professor Bull, or...?
I did not choose Belfast. I chose Professor Bull. And they told me, you know something, you got the scholarship, but it is in Belfast. I said, where is that exactly? I know it's in the north.
Yeah.
Then they told me it was Northern Ireland. And when I came with my wife, we were really a young couple without children.
You had already children?
No, we did
And you
not
didn't
have.
children?
No, we were married a few years. And I came and I found the name coming back again and again, Ulster. And I said, Ulster must be a very rich man. And then it turned out that it was the name of the Northern Ireland, is Ulster.
That's right. For what was Professor Bull famous? Of course, for his work in acute renal failure also, but what did you learn particularly well there in Belfast?
Professor Bull was the British young, promising professor who described in 1950-51 the acute tubular necrosis. And he published that in the Lancet, and then he published again in the British Medical Journal the retroplacental hemorrhage as a cause of acute renal failure. So he was well known for the acute renal failure, and he treated acute renal failure by the Bull's regime, which contained no proteins, because he wanted to tide over the patient, over his illness, to keep him alive, because dialysis was not yet
Just
started. It started when I was there, and I did my first dialysis with Mary McEwen, who is now retired, in the Belfast City Hospital.
They must have had peritoneal dialysis though at that time, or was that...
He did not use it.
He did not use it?
Yes,
He was opposed to it?
it was used in Boston.
Yeah. But he knew of the existence of peritoneal.
Yes,
no?
but he did not use it.
No.
I don't know why.
Yeah. So at that time one already realized that in fact acute tubular necrosis, as it was called, miscalled, I think it's a misnomer,
Yes.
but okay, that when the patient survived, that there was full recovery. They knew
Yes, he knew that it was full recovery, but tied him over.
this. Yeah.
And this was his problem, and that's why he gave the bulls regime and kept them in an isolated room. And you had to wear the mask and the gloves to come and treat such a patient in a side room with complete isolation, so that they will not be infected.
So
He knew about
He realized about the infection as
Oh,
one of the
yes.
major causes of death.
the oliguric phase, the polyuric phase, and all that sort of thing was well realized by Bull. But somehow he did not go into dialysis, even though dialysis existed in the Korean War. They took artificial kidneys in 1951,
Yes.
but he did not use it. It was 1958-59 that I spent these years with him. But towards the end, he did influence the Belfast City Hospital to get the artificial kidney.
I see. I see. How was he as a person, Professor?
Lovely person, very nice person, very English, of course.
Well.
He was born in Burma.
How would you define being English? We all have a picture of what being English,
Yes,
but how would you
very,
define
with a
it?
dry humor,
Yes.
very cut and
Polite,
polite.
distinguished.
Yes, and I met him again in Tanganyika. Actually, he was the advisor of the British government to medical schools. He was invited by Julius Nyerere to the to his Dar es Salaam, to his capital, and I was there on the East African Conference on Kidney Diseases.
Must have been one of the first organized
Yes.
in these
Yes.
areas there.
Yes.
Why were you invited there? You were already famous at that time, or?
Dr. Shiba was the boss of our hospital. He came to me one day and said, "Do you have anything to present scientifically?" I said, "Why?" He said, "We don't want the Egyptians to come.
I see.
We want to participate in the East India conference on kidney diseases." And I said, "I will present something on the concentration of the urea in acute renal failure." He said, "Go ahead, this is yours." And
That's why you went.
that's how I went. I was sent actually as a government employee, and succeeded in presenting a paper which was at the time quite well known, quite well taken, and the Egyptians really did not participate because of that.
Because you went there.
Yes.
Yeah. Fortunately, that has changed.
Fortunately, it has
Yes.
changed. Yes, we do not have.
When you then came back after your training in Belfast, I read in your curriculum that you actually was associated with the Institute of Cardiology, and that you were very well known for performing cardiac catheterization. So almost you took the wrong road, and you went into the direction of cardiology, or is that a misinterpretation?
No. When I came back, Shiba at the time, as he was called, the parental benevolent dictator, the director
Like so
of the
many at
hospital.
that time, yes.
The director of the hospital. He said, "You're already big. What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to do nephrology." And he said, "What's that?"
He didn't know, really? He didn't.
And you know something? I did not know exactly what it is myself.
You know,
And-
it has been said that the name nephrology was is originating from Bourget, that he
Yes.
coined that name.
Yes.
Is that?
I copied the name nephrology from Bourget
From Bourget.
before meeting him.
Yes.
But I heard that he said nephrology, and I liked the word
Mhm.
because it's not only dialysis, it's
Oh,
much
yeah.
more than that.
Yeah.
And he said, you know, in the Bible it's written, God is the examiner of kidneys and of the heart. So you do both. You do the heart first, that's what we need now. And you do the kidneys in the evenings when you have, at your spare time.
Was that really
Yes,
so?
and I did the dialyses were done at night at odd hours because it was not accepted. Because at the time, even our obstetrician, who was a very famous man, he decided that we don't need dialysis.
Really?
There are no acute renal failures in obstetrics.
Oh, really?
And I was shocked to hear that.
Mhm.
And they did not know how to diagnose it. And so I did the cardiology as a price, paid to do nephrology
Yes.
later on.
You were the only one then in the so-called department of nephrology, or were there other young doctors already
No, I
with
was
you?
the only one for a number of years.
Yes.
I think up to 1965, 66.
Yeah. And where did you learn the technology of dialysis at that time?
The first dialysis was done with Mary McEwen, as I said,
Mhm.
at the Belfast City Hospital.
Mhm.
Then, as I came back, I knew how to do it, and I asked them to buy the machine. The machine was bought, and it was left in the customs. They waited to pay $100 or so to take it out of
transportation?
customs.
Really?
When I was met with a case. A soldier girl was operated for her appendix. The appendix was not tied. She developed peritonitis. After that, she developed acute renal failure. And I told them this is acute renal failure and it needs dialysis. But I was too junior at the time.
Mhm.
They listened to me, but then they said, we don't have an artificial kidney. What shall we do? In Jerusalem, there is an artificial kidney. And at the time, this was the first helicopter evacuation. They took this soldier girl in this little Alouette
Mhm.
helicopter, which was given as a present by the French government to the Israelis, I think the only helicopter.
Mhm.
And she was taken to the so-called Davidka Square, a little square in the midst of Jerusalem, in the town of Jerusalem, city of Jerusalem. And because the Jerusalem people did not know, or whatever the reason, to do a dialysis in the evening seemed to be too strenuous, they said, we'll do it tomorrow morning. And she died of hyperkalemia.
Mhm.
Then her uncle came, and with $100, he told Dr. Shiva, here's the $100 so that others can profit. This was a dramatic moment,
Sure.
and after that we got the artificial kidney.
You realize now how many patients have actually died unnecessarily during these days for
Money.
administrative and other reasons. Well, or
That's the problem of administrative power.
that's right.
You cannot overcome it so easily.
No, that's right.
And I think sometimes administrators, instead of serving you, they think that you should serve them.
Mhm.
And here I would like to bring my resentment against this attitude. I think medicine is the thing that counts. And I would like to bring my belief that the administrator is there to help you and not to tell you what to do.
Mhm.
But sometimes this border is
Very flu.
not so sharp, and they expect of you as a doctor to serve the economics or political economic whatever you have to serve, and then they dictate to you what to do. And unfortunately many people have died because of lack of knowledge, because of misdiagnosis, because of misunderstanding, and I hope that things will change to a better way.
You started then dialysis in Lameire after the $100 were paid and the artificial kidney was brought into that hospital. You had to train a nursing staff also on dialysis.
Yes.
Did you do that yourself?
Yes, in the beginning I did almost everything almost myself. There was an interesting story that Lord Ziv had a grandchild, and his grandchild liked racing automobiles, and he had an accident in France. He was transported to London to be treated by dialysis, and he was saved by Sir Ralph Shackman, Mr. Ralph Shackman, a surgeon who operated the artificial kidney at the time. And then he was given a present to come to Israel for 2 weeks at the expense of the Ziff family of Marks and Spencers. When he came to Israel, he was told, help Eliahou to do the dialysis. And you know something, in retrospect, he did not know how to do the dialysis himself. I think the nurses did it. And I helped him rather than he helped me. But it was the initiation. We did the dialysis on an Arab girl who had favism, hemolytic anemia, and we saved the girl. And since then, I became, for the next 3-4 years, before my colleagues came, Ori Better and Rosenfeld, I was the only one who did dialysis for acute renal failure. And that started my career, really.
Yes. You must have worked 30 hours per 24. I mean, if you did the routine things in cardiology and in internal medicine, I suppose, during the day, and then at night the dialysis and the rest of kidney diseases, you must have been working very, very hard.
But we enjoyed working at the time.
Yeah.
We used to start at 7 in the morning and finish at 8 in the evening. We enjoyed it. My wife is a nurse at the same hospital, and we lived even in the hospital compound, and we enjoyed that. I think we that was time worth spending. It was really a joy to do a lot of work at the time.
When did you start your university career, as a professor or as a teacher? How is the system in Israel? Did it change a lot over these years? Or you said that when you arrived in Israel there was no medical faculty.
Yes. In the later 50s, the Jerusalem University opened up. And somehow the Jerusalem people looked down upon the people who are near the
hill.
Yeah, they're on the hills, near the sea. And quite a group got together and formed the Tel Aviv University. And in the middle of the 60s, I became a member of that university as a senior lecturer and worked my way up. I did some work. The first scientific work which I did was with Professor Bull on atrial stretch receptors, which today is actually atrial natriuretic peptide.
Sure. And what did you do with that? You looked at natriuresis, or why did you do that?
There was a group in the US of Gower and Henry.
Yes.
They decided that the atrium influences diuresis, and we wanted to see, Bull wanted to see if that is true. So he said, make some stretch receptors. I said, how can you measure stretch? You cannot. But then at the time they invented a new technology, the silastic silicon rubber tubes, which were very thin. And he said, put graphite in it. And I put graphite, and I did not get oscillations. So the only thing I could do is use mercury. And as the mercury was stretched, the resistance went up, and I got an oscillation. And the amplitude of pulsation was correlated with diuresis.
You have described that somewhere? You have
Yes,
published this?
yes.
With Bull?
With Bull,
With Bull.
yes.
So already at that time, Bull, being a clinician,
Yes.
in the first place, also had some research department in his renal division.
Yeah, I think he had 2 units. He was at the Queen's University of Belfast, and he was in the Institute of Clinical Science. He called it the Institute of Clinical Science, and there he did his research. And the unit was, the hospital unit, the Department of Medicine, was in the Queen's, in the Royal Victoria Hospital, which was next to it. And there I studied also doing kidney biopsy And my first kidney biopsy I did with trepidations, and they told me I was waiting for the answer, and there was the answer hung in the room of the doctors in a frame, and they told me, look at it, normal liver.
Did that really happen?
Yes.
That was the old Wim Silverman.
Yes, of course.
Which was a murderous weapon.
Yes,
at
a
that
murderous
time.
weapon.
I remember that, yes.
When I came to Israel, they wanted to prove that familial Mediterranean fever had affected the kidney, because they didn't know what was affecting the kidney. Later on we know that it is amyloidosis, and they depended on me to do the biopsies, and I must say that it was murder. It was not very easy to do the biopsies with the Wim Silverman needle. If I compare today's technology with the spring action, it was really very bad.
So at the university then you became then a teacher, of course, a teacher of teachers, because you started a real school where foreigners, young fellows and also Israeli fellows were trained. How many, do you have any idea how many fellows that you actually educated and trained in research and in clinical nephrology? Did you ever count them?
No, I don't count them, but every year there were a few who came from Israel and from abroad. The person whom I liked very much, for example, in the beginning from Yugoslavia, Dr. Bata.
Mm-hmm.
He came to me and said, he was older than me and I was a young doctor, and I diagnosed acute renal failure by the osmometer, isoosmotic urine and plasma, together with high urine sodium and oliguria.
Yeah.
And I said, let's publish our first 25 or 30 cases of acute tubular necrosis. He said, no, don't do that. I said, why? He said, the methodology that you have is more important. And that's how I described the diagnosis of acute renal failure in the Nephron, which was published in 1965.
Yes. So that started a whole range of publications. I didn't count them, but there are numerous and still going on until today. Now let's come back to your to the university career. Normally in a university you have 3 jobs. Yes, you have a teaching job. You are normally the chief of an important department, so you're also a doctor, and then of course you have to be an administrator, because your service has a budget. You have to hire people to manage that. How would you consider yourself as a manager of a renal division?
I always wanted to do medicine and less administration.
Yeah, but
maybe
you
need
a minimum of administration.
Yeah, the administration was kept to a minimum by myself, and that's what brought certain frictions with the real administration. Because I wanted to develop things, I wanted to have freedom of research, freedom of development. I still believe that the freedom of research and development has to be given to the doctor. And an example of this friction is when Dr. Shiba came to me and he said, stop running, don't run. The army goes by the slowest soldier. And I remember answering him, if there is someone running, run after him and learn from him, and don't stop him to go below his abilities. I am still a believer that we should run forwards if we can, because this brightness, or this, when you see the light suddenly, this comes and goes. It doesn't stay with you. You might have it this year, you might have it 10 years later, but it will go. So you should catch this bright brainstorm of a young man who is developing it and try to give him all the facilities to to implement, to develop that bright brainstorm which he has. For example, I would like to stress that in grantsmanship, when you apply for a grant, you've got to follow strict rules to get your grant. You almost tell them what you're going to find. And this is not real research. Research comes as a bright idea, and you can never plan it, very rarely so.
Today you have indeed, one has often the idea that besides brains and intelligence, you also need lots of money and sophisticated equipment to do research. How is the situation nowadays in Israel for as funding, public or private funding of research, especially in nephrology?
It's difficult. It's not easy like other places. The big funds come from the two countries, the USA and the German government. There are
by all means.
Yes,
by all means,
yes. This is the binational fund. The binational fund is that if you have a collaborator in that country, then he can, together with you, apply for a grant. So you have the local person and the German person, or the local person and the American person, and you apply for the binational foundation. And then you're funded generously. Usually you can come to $80,000 or something like that, which locally you cannot have. That much money you cannot have. But there are problems. For example, out of 600 applications, only 50 were funded from the binational U.S.-Israel Foundation.
I see.
So
Are
that
there other means? Israel, the state of Israel?
yes,
supporting
when you get funds of around $5,000 to $10,000, you can find that.
Yeah.
You can find that more easily. But big funds for big research projects, you need to comply with all the bureaucracy and the conditions of the binational foundations. And this means filling forms, applying only once a year, not more.
I see.
It's not easy.
Do you have an important teaching task, I mean in hours per week for the students? And how is nephrology taught at the undergraduate student level at your institution or elsewhere in Israel? Is that part of internal medicine course, or is that separate?
For many years I have been the examiner or I prepared the exams for nephrology. And I always looked at the nephrology as it's something that I mentioned. I copied the word from Humboldt, and it became a reality. It became a profession with examinations, and I did not expect it. But anyway, I did the questionnaires, I did the tests, and we had to do 2 years of nephrology in a recognized nephrological unit. And here there were problems. I maintained that every nephrological unit should have not only the dialysis unit, but also all of nephrology, including a lab. Including a lab which served the purpose of development. They developed these things that are needed by this unit.
I see.
And I think I succeeded at the end. We do have a lab everywhere, so that later on, as things developed, it became an established profession with exams, with teaching, with a syllabus, and you have to do it. But though there are many forces that try to minimize it and say go into nephrology without going into internal medicine. And the reason why they want to go into nephrology without internal medicine is that during internal medicine you might lose some of the people. And
But what do you mean by that? Lose oh yeah.
He will stay in internal
another,
medicine,
yeah.
in another profession.
Nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that, but if you want him in nephrology, keep him in nephrology.
Yeah.
But that's not true, because then you're developing technicians and not well-rounded physicians. That's why I think the syllabus of the university must have at least 2 to 3 years of internal medicine before the person goes into nephrology. And I would like to see the nephrologist go into a consultation knowing what he's talking about and not just dialyzing or
Yes.
not dialyzing.
Yes. So we covered your, let's say, teaching role. We covered a little bit your management role. Now, you are, of course, not only a researcher, but also an excellent clinician. You must have had in your rich career quite some patients that whose lives were saved by you. You must also have had deceptions, of course, like any other doctor. Can you remember some illustrious patients that you have saved or probably helped pass away, as they say in North America? Can you recall, at least one name comes in my mind, but I let you say it, that you probably prevented from dialysis.
Oh, if the meaning is to Moshe Dayan,
Yes.
the chief of staff, in 1968, I came home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and my wife said, you know, they brought Moshe Dayan in a bad condition. He's injured. Now,
What happened?
Moshe Dayan gave the order to go into Jordan, that is, the army should go into Jordan and attack a certain area. And to relieve himself, he went on an archaeological dig. And the hill caved in on him, and he was buried alive under the rubble, under the sand or the earth. And nearby there was a person, a farmer. He saw it and rushed and with his own hands opened the space so that he could breathe until help came. And he was taken to our hospital. He didn't have urine. That's why I was called.
Sure.
Immediately. So I imagine rushing at a very high speed, going to the hospital, trying to save Moshe Dayan. At the time, I toyed with the idea that if you catch acute renal failure in its incipient stage, when the urine osmolality was still more than the blood, like 350 as opposed to 300, you could save the patient by giving the osmotic diuretic mannitol. And I went to the Moshe Dayan. There was this, I catheterized him, took some urine out, and got out of the bed and wanted to send the urine to the lab. And I looked around me to see if I could ask anyone for help to rush to the lab and give it. And there was the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Minister of Internal Affairs, anybody.
The whole Israeli government.
Yeah, the whole government was there. But I could not, so I had to take the urine myself, swallow my pride, and take the urine to do the osmolality. And there it was, quite high, higher than the blood. And I gave him mannitol and some saline, and he passed urine. And I saved him from dialysis.
Really?
But the interesting story comes a couple of days later. He had a mediastinal hematoma because of fractures of vertebrae. I think it was thoracic 7 and 8 or 8 or 9.
Vertical.
And you could see the whole area in the X-ray was blurred. It was a big hematoma. They called me at 4 o'clock in the morning, come to the hospital immediately. I came. What happened? They said, we cannot find the carotid artery, and the left hand has no pulse, no blood pressure. So we are going to call DeBakey from Texas, who is on standby, to come and operated his dissection aneurysm.
Yeah.
And I was really sleepy. I went, I said, can I examine the patient? They said, yes. His patch in the eye was on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
The door was on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
So I came in from the left, and to see me, he turned around to see me with the good eye,
Mm-hmm.
covering his carotid altogether. And I could not, he told me, hello, good morning. I told him, please look at the right side. And like a good soldier, he
did.
turned completely to the right side, and there was the carotid artery. I asked for the sphygmomanometer, and they gave me two. One for the right hand, one for the left hand. I said, no, only one, please. And on the right side, there was blood pressure. On the left side, there was blood pressure, 140 systolic. And it seemed that the sphygmomanometer with which they did the blood pressure on the left hand was blocked by a plastic because it was new. It was taken from the, for Moshe Dayan, they would take a new one.
Of course.
And it was blocked, and that's how they found zero blood pressure.
My goodness. So you actually saved him twice. Once from artificial kidney and twice from the Becky. I wonder what would be worst. But you still have other stories on famous patients, or
I would like to
perhaps
tell you
a little bit less famous, maybe, because Moshe Dayan. How was he, by the way, as a person, as a patient? Of course, as a patient, you may be different than you
He
know.
was very stoic, very
military,
regimented, military-like, and he did exactly what he was told.
Like any good soldier.
Yeah, like any good soldier. And he woke up every day at 6 a.m. exactly to listen to the news from Cyprus, the BBC news. He appreciated that very much.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, our army was stuck in Jordan. Some tanks had to be abandoned, and he was giving the orders as if I was not doing anything. I was taking blood, I was measuring blood pressure.
Really?
He was just letting this alone, letting us do what we needed, and he gave the orders.
So he was still working while he was hospitalized?
Yes, he was working. And the nurse who worked next to me was a lovely, nice-looking girl, Maxa, who was born in Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
And the next day I came to her and I said, Maxa, did he pinch you? She said, no. I said, he's not well. And when she said yes,
then you knew he was recovering.
He was recovering.
Yes. You must have been, especially in the clinical field of acute renal failure, you were a great, and you still are a great believer in the prevention of acute renal failure. How many times could you actually do that? By measuring the urine osmolality, the fractional excretion of sodium, giving the fluid and the mannitol, because that is still very valid today. I recall an episode with a soldier also, or with a pilot, an Israeli pilot that was shot down in Egypt.
Yes.
I think this is a very instructive story also.
In 1970, a pilot was shot into Egypt over the Suez Canal, and he was on a mission, and he was injured. He had amputation of the leg, the reason of which I do not know, but an Egyptian young doctor.
So he was captured by the
He was
Egyptian
captured
army.
by the Egyptian, and the Egyptian young doctor decided that he will save his life by dialysis.
Mm-hmm.
So he did the dialysis with the arteriovenous shunt
Mm-hmm.
on one hand. He did one dialysis, the second dialysis on the other hand, and the third dialysis on one foot. And after that, he told his army personnel, that's it, he doesn't have any more accesses, and he's going to die. And there was heavy pressure on the on the Egyptian government, by the Israeli government through other countries, to release the prisoner. They asked me, what should we do? And I said, call Niels Alwall from Sweden. He is the advisor to the military of Egypt.
Oh,
He was then the advisor of the Egyptian military services on kidney diseases.
you're not disclosing any military secrets
No,
here.
he was.
Okay.
Niels Oswald is no more, and we are in peace with Egypt. But they told me to stay at home, not to go out.
Yes.
We are going to a neutral country, and this neutral country, you will not need anything from them. You will not take anything from them. You will take everything with you. And the next day, they told me we are going to Nicosia, Cyprus, and there we are going to take everything with us. So I took an artificial kidney, I took the lab, I almost emptied everything in the department and went into the plane. And it was a Nord plane, a French carrier plane. Noisy and shaky, whatever. And we went to Nicosia. And in Nicosia, they were all in uniform. I wasn't. I was a civilian. I stayed aside. I brought my long lens and camera to photograph the event. And then suddenly, the UN members, officers, told us, the Egyptian plane is coming and bringing the prisoner. You better go and line up under the wing of your aircraft. So we were given the order, and we went and lined up with police protecting us. And the plane, a little plane, Antonov plane, came and landed between two huge airplanes. And they started marching, the UN people, towards the Egyptian plane. Then suddenly they come back and say, but we need someone to come and take the prisoner. And the commander looked around and looked at me and said, you go. I said, why me? I'm a doctor. He said, you are the only one in civilian clothes. If they kidnap you, it's not a problem. If they kidnap an army personnel, it's a problem. It's a problem. It's a fighting. So I had to go. So I said, you take the camera, take the photographs, I'll go. And I held the door. I said, anybody home? But they did not care. They helped me take the prisoner. And the moment we took him, we started working on him. We gave him an infusion. We took him to the dialysis unit immediately. I think it took less than an hour between the release of the prisoner from the Antonov airplane to good dialysis at Lameire. We landed at the Lod airport, a helicopter waited, the ramp went down from both, and the pilot was taken into the helicopter. Before the door closed, they flew up, they were in the air, and we gave him an infusion right there and then, and he was put on dialysis from Saturday to Thursday, non-stop.
And what kind of access did you use then? Because the Egyptian colleague...
I operated him.
Oh, you operated?
I operated him higher up.
Yes.
And used continuous dialysis. At the time it was not known, and I wanted to reduce his hypercatabolism as much as I could. He was septic. His urine was very, he had a catheter, and it was mucky with a lot of pus. We washed it, and I remember we used neomycin solution, and we did some debridement on his amputation, and he recovered, and he became a doctor.
He became a doctor?
Yes, now he's a doctor.
You still have contact with
Yes.
him?
Yes.
That is fantastic.
He
Did you
comes from
ever
there.
meet the Egyptian colleague?
No.
You never met him?
No, I didn't.
It's too bad, actually.
Actually, I should.
Yes.
I should.
Now, besides this dramatic stories on patients, and the most famous one, Moshe Dayan, you must also, in the academic nephrological world that you're frequently present and also since many years highly esteemed. You must also have met, besides Professor Boule, who was your mentor, other very famous, let's say, founding fathers of nephrology. I know that at a given time Gabriel Richet came to Israel and Jean Hamburger came to Israel. Did you have a chance to meet them there and to appreciate or having other feelings on them?
When in 1968, Hamburger, Richet, and Treget from Lyon
Yes.
came on a government mission to Israel to sort of on a lecture tour. But they were given the order to speak only in French,
Oh, really?
not in English. They were not allowed to speak in English.
Oh, really?
Because it was de Gaulle's time.
Yes.
And he was very much adamant about the French fame and so on. And so they came in Israel and they gave talks in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv and Haifa. I found it difficult to relate with Hamburger. He was too high up, too lofty. Richet was more of a friend.
Warmer.
Warmer.
A warmer personality, yes.
And Treget was a neutral person, but Richet was the warm person. He understood us. He sympathized with us. But then they were established nephrologists, international fame. And I was just sort of someone trying to find his way amongst all the things, the developments that were on, that were going on.
So you actually a long-standing relationship with somebody like Jean Hamburger you didn't have. That was the only
No.
occasion that you met him? You must have met him several times
Yes,
at conferences
I met him
or so.
in his in Paris in his unit,
Oh, yeah.
and that was very dramatic also.
Who's up?
It
Explain
was
that.
he was on a sort of a semicircle, in the center of the semicircle. On the right and on the left, you had his associates and assistants and
The court.
the court, yes.
Court.
And there was a bed in the center and a paravent
Yes.
to cover. And this little woman comes in and says, Monsieur le Professeur, and say, Madame, Mademoiselle, so-and-so. She had a dialysis or whatever it is, a transplant, and he would say, suppose we examine Mademoiselle this and that. And immediately the nurses would address her, and another doctor would come out from the side and suppose we give her this and that. Immediately the others were writing and listening to him, and it was very interesting.
What they call, yes, the mandarins, actually, at that time. Although he was a great
he was
nephrologist,
great, yes.
there's no question about that. But he knew it a little bit too much, perhaps, that he was
Yes.
great, yes. Yes. Now, you are very much involved, actually you are instrumental in the creation and also in the continuation of the task force for disaster relief. I must say that I'm also involved in that, as you know, that some other famous nephrologists are quite skeptical about this whole affair, about this initiative of the ISN Commission on Acute Renal Failure. I know you're in favor of it, but why should they remain skeptical? Do you have any idea about that?
I think that the other people are really looking at the nephrologist as a person who would sit in an easy chair and do the dialysis when necessary, to give the orders, to be in his castle, in his ivory tower. And my background dictates to me that if you want really to do anything, you've got to go into the field, give the infusions right there and then before you save or before you take out the body of the patient from the rubble or from the earthquake, from whatever disaster that happened. And that's why I urged Kim Soles that we should not become only people who would come late. We want to come early. We want to play a part in the prevention. We want to know, we want to deal with the acute phase of the injury and not stand by and do only dialysis as technicians. And this will bring us to something which is quite of political importance. Is acute renal failure going to be treated by intensivists without the nephrologist? And that's a problem, because if you stand back, there is no vacuum in life. Immediately it's taken by someone else. And the people, the intensivists, whoever it is going to take over. I think the nephrologist is going to be important if he wants to keep his acute renal failure field. He has got to go to the field, to the site of injury, to give the infusion, to make the diagnosis, to prevent acute renal failure. I have a feeling that you're not going to need dialysis in disasters. I have a feeling that our task force should aim more at the prevention. And the prevention, beside the well-known infusions and mannitol, which worked for so many years, we have a new instrument, and that's the natriuretic agents, the atrial natriuretic peptide, what is called auriculin, and better still, the urodilatin. The Hanover group is using urodilatin to prevent acute renal failure in liver transplants. Why shouldn't we use it? It's true that we should not use the disaster area as an experimental ground. But you know something? I think within a year or two, this is not going to be experimental. And I have a feeling that this is an answer to acute renal failure. So that I want to keep this within nephrology. Just like I want to keep hypertension in nephrology.
Another battlefield.
Another battlefield which I won. The Israel Society of Nephrology is called the Israel Society of Nephrology and Hypertension. I have published the obesity and hypertension.
I've seen that, yes.
Without salt restriction. And I am publishing now in the American Journal of Medicine that insulin is causes hypertrophy of the coronary media, and therefore, and causes hypertension in the spontaneously hypertensive rats or in the predisposed hypertensive patients with genetic background. That means I am a great believer that if I have to be a good nephrologist, I've got to be a good internist as well as hypertension person. And I think that hypertension and acute states belong to nephrology and not to someone else.
Yes. Are you satisfied? We just had a very successful ISN meeting in Madrid. We are now here in Barcelona for also a very successful meeting on acute renal failure. Are you satisfied when you now look back and you have lived the history of the international community of nephrology? Are you satisfied with the evolution of our society? Would you recommend some changes or give some directions, other directions to take? There is a tendency that the ISN is devoting efforts and also money to the developing countries. Do you believe in that, in this enterprise? Or do you say, well, why should we not stay more or less a pure scientific organization and leave it these problems which to others, to governments or other organizations? What do you think about it?
No, I am a great believer in the International Society of Nephrology. I think it has done a lot. I did not want the task force to come out of, to make a separate society of acute renal failure. I maintained that we should be within the ISN, and I hope that we will remain, because I'm a great believer in the society, in its endeavors, not only in the scientific field. The scientific field is a different world for the scientists, for those who are interested. I think it helped a lot in the formation of nephrology and to save the acute renal failures in developing countries. And we are still needed. I can't hear that cholera should cause acute renal failure or a snake bite should cause acute renal failure in India. I wouldn't dream of it. Today, I would accept an acute renal failure if you do sophisticated cardiac surgery or bone marrow transplantation, but I would not want to hear that a miserable person bitten by a snake should develop acute renal failure and we should have a mortality of 60 to 80%. Therefore, we are needed for the developing countries, and I believe what I always believed: the better the services, the higher the mortality in acute renal failure. Because
that you have to explain, though.
You have good services of evacuation, of treatment to prevent acute renal failure in the milder cases. If you have good services, your evacuation is good, your treatment is good, your definitive treatment is good, surgery and so on, you are left only with the very, very bad cases who are going to die anyway from the injury, the basic injury. So the better your services, the higher the mortality.
So you believe that the efforts that are going to take place in the near future on trying to establish a scoring system for severity of illness, as you said, patients that are going to die anyway and that perhaps should not be started with treatment, you believe in this concept? Or don't you believe?
I don't think that that we should do the scoring system to decide on treatment, because things change. They will change for the better. And what you scored today is no good tomorrow. It's going to change. So that you should not use the scoring system as a parameter by which you judge if you're going to give treatment or not. You should use it to compare patients between one unit and another, probably, under certain classifications. But I would not use it as a parameter to decide if I'm going to give a treatment. I'm afraid, what's going to happen if I give too much treatment? Today, dialysis is available. It's not something rare. I can always call on the chronic unit, give a dialysis to this man, and within a couple of hours I have solved the problem. So I gave 4 dialyses more, 10 dialyses more, let's say 100 per year more, and I am relieved of the task of playing God, who is going to live and who is going not to live. And I want to mention that in the early 70s, when we developed the chronic renal failure system, treatment, I was forced for a while to be a member of a group which would decide who is going to have dialysis and who is not, because there were not enough available spaces. And I remember my resentment, and I remember a certain friction between the administration, who told me, you've got to be there. And I said, I don't want to be there, because I will choose everybody for dialysis. It's just like the patient. There was a young woman who was pregnant, and they asked me, do you want her to continue with the pregnancy? She had a kidney disease. And I said, no, she will accelerate her nephritis. You've got to stop this pregnancy. So they made an abortion. A couple of years later, she came up for dialysis. And I said, you cannot take this woman because she has no children. You have a woman who has 4 children. She comes first. And the head of the department came to me and said, you have done harm to this woman twice. You stopped her from having a child, and now you prevent her from taking dialysis. And this I will not forget.
I believe that must be, yeah, it's dramatic.
This is very
dramatic, yes. Do you have, because this interview can go on for hours, I guess, and I think one moment we have to stop. I would like to dwell some more minutes, or let's say a very short time, on what you're doing actually now. I know that you have been retiring from your official duties at the Lameire. I know that you are still very, very busy in research and probably also in patient care. You can fill up your days now that you are officially retired?
May I now make a strong point?
Sure.
I hope it will not hurt anybody. I do not believe in retirement. I do not believe in administrators who force you to retire. I resent that. I will combat it in every way I can. I continue to work as long as God has given me the health to work. I will continue to progress in my profession wherever I can find the background for it. I believe, as I said before, that those who are administrators are there to serve me and not me to serve them. But they make a mistake of not knowing the borders and the limitations. I have developed now a system in which I do my research in another hospital, basic research in hypertension and in acute renal failure. We have just finished the work on insulin in hypertension.
Mm-hmm.
We are continuing it now in a more prolonged fashion to see if insulin is really atherogenic. On the acute renal failure, we have done the urodilatin in rats, and we found out that urodilatin does not work through the antioxidant systems, but we will continue to investigate whether it's working through other means. That's research. It does not make money.
No, it costs money, actually.
It costs money.
Yes.
Then on the other side, I have developed a private dialysis center, smaller than the Lameire, which numbered 140 patients, and now I have about 20 patients. I can remember their names, I can remember their needs, and I will try to give them the best service I can. I believe in the prevention of chronic renal failure by proper hydration, and the work that was done by Liz Bankier, for example,
Mm-hmm.
on hydration delaying the progression of chronic renal failure is of note, and I follow that. And my specialty now is to delay rather than accelerate the need for dialysis as much as I can within my limitations. I hope that within the near future we will have developed better drugs, anti-inflammatory drugs or anti-nephritic drugs
Mm-hmm.
to delay the progression of chronic renal failure and decrease the need for dialysis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, do you, before we are concluding this, there is one problem that I would like to discuss with you, and this is the problem of renal transplantation, particularly in Israel. If you look at the numbers, as you know, Israel participates in the EDTA registry. I think, but I can be mistaken, that transplantation is not so high in Israel as you would expect that from a country with that standard of living. Is there any particular reason for that? Is there religiously a reason for that? I know, for example, that some Israeli people come to Belgium to be transplanted.
Oh yes.
And that is strange, isn't it? Or is it not
Yes,
strange?
because it's a small country of 5 million, more or less, and the number of transplants come to 120 on 5 million. That means just over 20, 25 per million. It's rather small, because the religious groups resent or they do not allow organs to be taken from a body. And I was in the early 80s, I tried to fight that law that came into being, to ask the family and to ask everybody, and to have an acceptance. It's enough if one would say no, then you do not transplant, you do not take the organs. But that law came into being because it was a political issue. But I had fought it quite a lot in the early 80s. I went up to Jerusalem. I had even a chair in the Knesset,
oh, really?
Where I used to go every morning and shout, follow the debates, shout there.
Yeah.
But that is history now. The rule is that you should ask the family. If you cannot find anybody for a reasonable amount of hours, like 6 or 8 hours, then you can take the organs.
Oh, yes.
At least this we introduced. I believe that you really should ask the family. I do not believe in snatching organs. And I think that we need to do more education. But somehow we have a problem with the transplant religious groups who do not want to give the organs.
It happens quite often that in a country of like Israel, that the religious sentiments are so strong, which of course everybody respects, but that they must create some conflicts for a doctor who really wants to give priority to a given problem. Is that not creating a moral dilemma sometimes in a physician in Israel? It must be, no?
It is. And many times when the very religious person needs a kidney, and you tell him, I want to take it from this person, he doesn't want to see. He doesn't want to hear. You take it from anybody you want. It's just like going into the shop of ham and saying, can I have some of this chicken?
Yes.
And he says, do you mean ham, sir? He said, I did not ask you what it is.
Yeah. I asked for chicken.
I asked for chicken, this chicken.
Yes.
And it's a problem, and we cannot, it will take time.
Sure.
But we can, there are people from Israel who go abroad to look for kidneys and livers and hearts.
I think we must come to a conclusion, and I think the obvious last question that I should ask you, if you look back at your career, you are in an extremely good position to give advice to young people. What would be your recommendations to a brilliant young doctor for the moment who says, I want to do nephrology, what kind of attitude should I have? Can you, based on your experience, say, don't do that, but do that? Or any recommendations you want to give, or any comments on that? I know it's a difficult question. I think would be very welcome.
I would like to tell my young colleagues that if you want to be a nephrologist, don't aim at a low standard. Go and do internal medicine. Go and specialize in a good lab, and then become a nephrologist, so that you will not stand helpless when you are presented with a patient. You will know about everything, the antibiotics that you use, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, the physiology, the pathology, the heart transplantation, the cardiac output. You know what's an ejection fraction, and not just stand there because somebody is telling you the ejection fraction is so. And so learn a little more before you become a nephrologist. And when you do become a nephrologist, try to be independent, try to help your fellow men, and try to give the best service you can, but do not be pressured by those people who hold the money, the economic politics. It's a problem sometimes. Try to go in between the drops, so to speak, and not to get wet, and and do the best you can for the patient, because after all, it's the patient whom we care for, and all our stimuli should come from the patient's needs for research, for development. We don't need to do a research on something theoretical. We still need the practical aspects. And that's what I would tell my colleagues.
Can I ask you a last question? Are you a grandfather?
Yes, I became
How
a grandfather last year.
Last year, so you have one grandchild.
One grandchild.
Is he
a daughter.
would you advise him to become a doctor if you can?
My daughter is studying medicine. She thinks that the medicine we are doing is not good enough. And she wants to combine the Chinese medicine with the classical medicine, the alternative medicine with the classical medicine. I wish her success, but I told her that if you want to do medicine, you've got to know the classical medicine first. In the back of my mind, I hope that she will stick to classical medicine.
Yeah, okay. Haskel, thank you very, very much for this, for me at least, very, very excellent hour that we passed together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I tell you just one little story
Please.
about Mrs. Karayanidis?
Mrs. Karayanidis.
Mrs. Karayanidis was the girl of the Isle of Rhodes. And her husband, who owned a shipping company, a travel company, and a hotel and a bus company, brought her to me. He said, I don't want her to go into dialysis. She has a chronic renal failure. And then I found out what gave me a big push, and that she was a salt loser. She was going into hyponatremia, hypochloremia, and going into uremia. The moment you gave her a liter of salt, everything was fine. So she used to come every year by boat, and we were invited to go to Rhodes, and it took 10 years before she really needed dialysis. In the meantime, her husband died, and Mrs. Karayanidis now is doing dialysis in the Isle of Rhodes, but not in 1980 as her doctors wanted, but she started it after 91, 92.
Has, of course, improved her chances.
Yes. So that is one of the things that I do for the prevention of renal failure.
Very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we are through. Good.